It was a typical New England autumn when the Langley family moved into the old Victorian house on Ashcroft Lane. The house had been vacant for years, its imposing structure looming over the quiet street like a forgotten sentinel. For the Langleys, it was a dream come true, a fresh start, a place to build new memories. Henry Langley, a history professor at the local college, had always been fascinated by the house's rich history. His wife, Sarah, was charmed by its character and potential. Their 2 children, Emily and Jake, were excited about having more space to play and explore. But from the moment they stepped inside, an unsettling feeling seemed to pervade the air. The house was filled with strange creaks and groans. The kind that old houses often make. But these sounds seemed different, almost deliberate. At first, they dismissed it as their imaginations running wild, or the house settling after years of neglect. But soon, the noises became harder to ignore. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, a loud thump echoed through the house. Sarah looked up from her book, her brow furrowing in concern. "Did you hear that?" Henry nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Probably just the old pipes. I'll check it out." He grabbed a flashlight and made his way down to the basement. The stairs creaked under his weight. And the air grew colder as he descended. The basement was dark and damp, filled with cobwebs and forgotten boxes. Henry shivered, both from the cold and an inexplicable sense of unease. As he reached the bottom, he heard another thump, this time closer. He swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. He shook his head, feeling foolish. Of course, there was no one there. Just an old house making old house noises. He checked the pipes, finding nothing amiss, and made his way back upstairs. But as he reached the top of the stairs, he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. "Behind you." He paused, his heart pounding. But there was only silence. Over the next few weeks, the noises continued. Thumps, whispers, and strange creaking sounds that seemed to follow them from room to room. Emily and Jake complained of nightmares. "I see you." Waking up in the middle of the night in tears. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible tapping coming from the walls. She paused, her knife hovering over the cutting board, and listened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get her attention. "Henry?" she called out, her voice tinged with fear. "Do you hear that?" Henry entered the kitchen, his expression concerned. "Hear what?" "The tapping. It's coming from the walls." Henry listened, but he heard nothing. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's an old house, Sarah. It's bound to make some noise." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, as As the family sat down for dinner, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more persistent. Emily and Jake exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide with fear. "What's that noise, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Henry forced a smile. "It's just the house, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the weeks turned into months, the noises grew more frequent and more disturbing. Objects began to move on their own. Doors would slam shut, and the temperature would drop suddenly, leaving the family shivering in their own home. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard the soft whispering again. It seemed to be coming from the walls, a faint, almost inaudible murmur. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard it again, louder this time. "Emily," she gasped, her eyes widening in terror. "Mom! Dad!" she screamed, scrambling out of bed and running down the hall to her parents' room. Henry and Sarah woke with a start, rushing to comfort their terrified daughter. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, holding Emily close. "I heard someone calling my name," Emily sobbed. "It was coming from the walls." Henry exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. "It's just a bad dream, Emily. There's no one in the walls." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that his daughter might be telling the truth. Determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences, Henry began researching the history of the house. He spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. What he discovered sent chills down his spine. The house had a dark and tragic past. It had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Samuel Blackwood. According to the records, Blackwood had gone mad and murdered his entire family before taking his own life. Since then, the house had changed hands many times, with each new owner reporting strange occurrences and unexplainable events. Henry's heart raced as he read the accounts. Could the spirits of Blackwood and his family still be lingering in the house, trapped in the walls, seeking revenge or redemption? He returned home, his mind racing with questions. He needed to find a way to communicate with whatever was haunting their home, to understand what it wanted. Desperate for answers, Henry and Sarah decided to hold a séance. They invited a local medium, a woman named Margaret, to help them connect with the spirits. The night of the séance was cold and windy, the howling wind adding to the eerie atmosphere. The family gathered in the living room, holding hands around a small table. Margaret closed her eyes and began to chant softly, her voice a soothing presence in the tense room. "Spirits of the house, we call upon you," she intoned. "Speak to us. Tell us what you want." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the room grew colder, and the air seemed to thicken. A faint whisper filled the air, growing louder and more distinct. "Leave. Now." The voice was guttural, filled with anger and despair. The family clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Revenge," the voice hissed. "He betrayed us. We suffer. Leave now, or suffer too." The room shook violently, the table rattling and objects flying off the shelves. The family screamed, breaking the circle and running from the room. Margaret stood, her face pale. "You must leave this house. The spirits are restless, and their anger is growing. If you stay, you will be in grave danger." Despite Margaret's warning, the Langleys were reluctant to leave. They had invested so much into the house, and leaving meant admitting defeat. But the strange occurrences continued to escalate, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, as they huddled together in the living room, the walls began to tremble. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Leave! Leave!" Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The air grew icy, and the whispers turned into screams. The family clung to each other, their hearts pounding in terror. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was the ghost of Samuel Blackwood, his face twisted in rage and torment. "You must leave," he hissed, his voice echoing through the room. "This house is cursed. It will consume you, just as it consumed me." Henry stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" Blackwood's eyes blazed with fury. "Justice. Release. I am trapped here, forced to relive my torment. Only by leaving can you save yourselves." The walls shook violently, and the temperature dropped even further. The family could feel the malevolent presence closing in around them. "Go!" Blackwood screamed, his voice filled with anguish. "Before it's too late." The Langleys didn't need any further convincing. They grabbed what they could and fled the house, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they ran down the street, they could hear the whispers fading into the distance, replaced by an eerie silence. They drove through the night, not stopping until they reached the safety of a motel miles away. There, they huddled together, too scared to sleep, their minds racing with the events of the night. In the morning, Henry called a real estate agent and put the house up for sale. They returned only once, in broad daylight, to collect the rest of their belongings. The house stood silent and empty, its walls no longer whispering, its malevolent presence temporarily sated. The Langley family eventually found a new home, far from Ashcroft Lane. They tried to put the events behind them, but the memory of the old house lingered like a dark,